This is Gemara Nazir Daf Yud Gimel. As you begin another incredible week of learning the Daf together, we pick it up on the bottom of Yud Beis Amid Beis from the Mishnah. Says the Mishnah, Areini Nazir. If someone says, I am a Nazir, Lichshayu Li Ben, he says, I will be a Nazir when a son will be born to me, and Ben, a son is born, Mazel Tov. What is the halacha? So this everyone can anticipate. Harez a Nazir, he is a Nazir. But now, what happens if not a son is born, but rather a daughter is born? Tumtum, someone who's born and we're not sure if he's a Zachar Nekeva, male or female. Vandragonis, someone who's born with both a simanim of a male and a female. What is the halacha? A Nazir. Simply, what's the reason? Because it's not a ben, it's not a son. Case number 1 of the Mishnah. Case number 2 of the Mishnah. If he says, Kishayu li Vlad, he doesn't say son. He says, when I'll have a Vlad, when I'll have a child. Then it says the Mishnah, even if a daughter is born, or tumtum v'adragonis, any form of child, harei Nazir, he's going to be a Nazir. Again, the simple reasoning is, because he said Vlad, he didn't specify. As we turn over to Yud Gimel and Aleph, says the Mishnah, but what happens if he piloi ishtoi? For Rahman al-Islan, his wife miscarries, then Einoi Nazir, because it's not a Vlad. Rav Shimon Aimer, says Rav Shimon, that in this case in which we're not necessarily sure what the story is, because he said Vlad, and then she had a Vlad, but the baby was born not alive, it was a miscarriage. Says Rav Shimon, Ye Omar, the person should say, if the child was born alive, and then the child died afterwards, then I am obligated to be a Nazir, and I accept upon myself a full-fledged Nazirus, like a regular Nazir. However, but says Rav Shimon, he should continue and stipulate that what? But if the child that was born was not a ben kayama, it was a true miscarriage, harei ani nazir nedava. So says Rav Shimon, due to this suffix we're going to be machmir, he should accept upon himself a nazirus, and he should say, if I'm really obligated because the child was born alive and then died, it's a real nazir. And if not, it should be a nedava, a optional nazirus. Chaz Rav Yalda, now says Rav Shimon, his statement that he said he's a Nazir if a child is born continues by the next child. Why? Because if the first child was not a child, then he said I'm a Nazir when I have a child, so that the next child he's really a Nazir. So then if he goes and he gives birth, he's a Nazir. Chaz Rav Yalda, the Tanakama says, then for sure you're a Nazir. Because the Tanakama paskin that the first child was a miscarriage, you're not a Nazir on the first kid, you're a Nazir on the second kid. What does Rav Shimon say? He says Rav Shimon 4 lines down, you give him an Aleph, Rav Shimon Aimer, Yamar again, he should say. Because again, Rav Shimon was concerned, apologies that the Gemara just shrunk. Rav Shimon was concerned that there was a form of Nazirus in the first child. So says Rav Shimon, now he should continue and he should say, Ima Risha ben Kayama. If the first one was a real child, then Arisha Chayva v'zunedava. Then indeed I was obligated in the first Naziros, and now I'm just saying an optional Naziros. V'imlav, and if the first child was not a viable child, Harisha Nedava v'zu Chayva. So Rav Shimon is more concerned about the suffix, both in child number 1 and child number 2, in a situation that someone says he's a Nazir, in the event that he gives birth, and what happens? He gives birth, but it was a miscarriage, and we're not sure. Was it a real birth, and then only afterwards the child died? Or no, to the child was born not a viable child. So says Rav Shimon, both on that kid and the next kid, he has to be a Nazir. Each time he says that tonight, that if it was not a child, that if it was a child, I'm a Nazir. If not, and the second time the reverse. Says the Gemara, Hi my lememra. Let's go back and we're going to, as always, dissect the Mishnah case by case. Case number 1 in the Mishnah said he's a Nazir if he gives birth to a ben. And he gives birth to a ben, it says he's a Nazir. Ask the Gemara, Hi my lememra. What's the Chiddush? Answers the Gemara, Misham Seifa, because of the next case, Bas Tumtum Andragonis Einoi Nazir. Says Gemara Pshita, that's also obvious. He said if I give birth to a son, and he does give birth to a son, he gives birth to a daughter, Tumtum Andragonis, he's not a Nazir. What's the Chiddush? Answers the Gemara, I would have thought, maybe when he says, when I have a ben, he doesn't mean ben as in male. He means ben as in, if I build a household, as in binah, to build. And therefore maybe a daughter, maybe a tumtum and androgynous is included in his statement of when he says I am a ben. Kamash malon deloi. So the chiddush is no. The chiddush is it's only a ben dafka and he gives birth to a daughter tumtum and androgynous. What is the status? He is not a Nazir. We continue about 10 lines down at the 2 dots, says the Gemara, the next case in the Mishnah. And if he says when I have a child, then everything is included. Ask the Gemara again. Pshita, it's obvious. Answers the Gemara, I would have thought, I would have thought it has to be a child that people consider a child. What do people consider a child? A son! Kamash one that no, even a daughter, tumtum and androgynous are included as well. We continue now to part B of the Mishnah, which was the cases of the miscarriages. What happens if he says, if I have a vlad and he piloi Nazir? Says the Gemara, man katani la. Who's the Tanakama? Who's the opinion that's arguing on Rav Shimon? Rav Shimon is being machmir in the case of Safek. So who is the opinion that's not being machmir in the case of Safek? This brings us back to the Gemara in Daf Chesam Aleph. Says the Gemara, Rav Yehuda dekrihu. Rav Yehuda, let's remember if someone says, I'm a Nazir, if this Kri had 100 core, and he goes and the Kri is missing or it was stolen, so Rav Shimon is nervous, Safek, you're a Nazir. Rav Yehuda says, no, you're not a Nazir. Similarly, in our Mishnah, Rav Yehuda says for a miscarriage, you're not a Nazir. We continue by quoting the sheet of Rav Shimon. Rav Shimon, says Rav Shimon, and he should regard, in all cases, accept upon himself Nazirus, and he should explain that if the first kid was a child, then he's a real Nazir, and if not, then it's an optional Nazirus. So, Bayi Minei Rav Abba May Rav Huna. Rav Abba asks from Rav Huna, Hareini Nazir Kshir Liben. If someone says, I'm a Nazir if I have a son, what happens? His wife miscarriages, Rahman al-Islam. V'hifrish carbon. And he goes, even though there was a miscarriage, but he goes and he separates a carbon for Nazirus. And then, lo and behold, the Chazra v'Yalda. On that same day, she gives birth. It was twins. Obviously, in a world before sonograms, they didn't necessarily know this. So she gives birth. Child A dies. He separates a carbon and as a Nazir. Then she gives birth to a viable child. Mahu. Says the Gemara in this fascinating case, what is the halacha? Explains the Gemara. Aliba deman. Who are you asking according to? Aliba de Rav Shimon mati ba'ila. If you're asking according to Rav Shimon, what's your question? It's pashit. Ha'amar Rav Shimon holds Rav Shimon safik naziris la'achmir. So in this case, you'd have to be machmir as well. Vela aliba de Rav Yehuda damar safik naziris la'hakel. So rather, we're asking Rav Yehuda, the Tanakh in our Mishnah is normally lenient. What about in this case when child A dies as a miscarriage and child B on the same day, the twin is a viable, healthy child? Mai kadosh oiloi kadosh. What is the status of the carbon that he separated? And what's this Dadei Shaila? The Shaila is, do we say that now that the second twin, when it's born, was viable, maybe that's a Megala that shows us that really child one was also viable. And then Rahman al-San was Nifter. What's the difference? The difference is if the child was viable and only Nifter afterwards, then indeed the carbon that he separated is a regular status of a carbon, because he has a din of a Nazira, he's the din of a Nazir. Or do we say no, the first child was a Nefel, and therefore the carbon is not a carbon? Says the Gemara, my nafkamina legizasai ula avdai boy. Nafkamina is meaning, because either way now he has to be a Nazir for the second child. So nafkamina is for the carbon that he separated, are you allowed to share it and work with it, or does it have the status of a carbon? Says the Gemara, Teku, indeed, it is a wonderful shaila that we're going to have to wait for Eliyahu Hanavi to deal with that. And we continue now, 8 lines from the bottom. Ben Ruchumi me Abayo. Ben Ruchumi asks of Abayo, Hareini Nazir l'chshuli ben. So it says, I'm a Nazir when I have a son. Vishamach Aveiroi, and his friend hears in. This is similar to what we learned the previous few days. V'amar ve'olai, and me as well. So Ruvain says, I'm a Nazir if I have a son. Shimon says, and I, ve'olai. Mahu, what is the halacha? Adiburei mashma, is he referring to the words? Meaning, he's going literally on what Ruvain said. And Ruvain said, when I give birth to a son, I'm a Nazir. Shimon says, and I, ve'alai. So when Ruvain gives birth to a son, Shimon is a Nazir as well. Oya gufei mashma. Or no, he refers to himself. And he's saying what Ruvain said should apply to me. Meaning, if I have a son, I'll be a Nazir. So what does the statement of Ve'alai mean? Says the Gemara in Timot Salayim Gufei Mashma. If you're going to tell me it means, take the statement of Ruvain and put it into Shimon's mouth. And if Shimon has a son, he's a Nazir. Amar Hareini Nazir L'chshuli Ben. But what happens now? If Ruvain says, I'm a Nazir when I have a child. V'shamach aviroi v'amar ve'ani. He doesn't say Ve'alai. This time, Shimon hears, and Shimon says, Va'ani. Ma'u, what's the halacha? Anafshei ka'amar, is he saying whatever happens to Ruvain will be to me? So if Ruvain has a son, I'm going to be a Nazir as well. Or perhaps, you know what he means? He means, Rachimna Allah kavoseich. I love you as much as you love yourself. No, excuse me, this is the opposite. One more time. Is he going anafshei? And now he means on himself, because the ve'ani and ve'alai are really the opposite. So by ve'alai, when we said, is he going adibure, meant whatever he said, or agufe, is he accepting upon himself something? Now says the Gemara, no. Is he going on avshei? Is he going about himself, meaning that he'll be a Nazir if he has a son? I love you as much as you love yourself, meaning when you have a son, I'll be a Nazir as well. So says the Gemara, if you're going to say that whenever he says it in the presence, in front of the first person, Kisifa le milsa. Says the Gemara, you know why he's talking in this funny way? Because maybe he's embarrassed. Kisifa le milsa, as we turn over to your Gimel Amid Beis, he's embarrassed to say in front of his friend that he as well wants to have a son. So instead of saying he himself wants to have a son, what does he do? He goes and he says this interesting statement. So Amar Hareini Nazir L'chshiyu Liploini Ben. So now what happens if someone says, I'm a Nazir when Ploini has a kid? And now B'shama Chaveiroi, the friend hears, meaning if the first va'ani meant when I have a kid, why when I have a kid? Because I'm embarrassed to say that I want to have a kid when you're saying you want to have a kid. But now, what if when you say when your friend has a kid, and I say va'ani, mao? So now Shaila number 3, do we say, since you're not in front of the third person, so he means on himself, and he means when I have a kid? Or he means I love you as much as you love yourself, and therefore whenever you have a kid, I'll be a Nazir. Tibai says the Gemara, all 3 shaylas have to wait for Eliyahu and Navi. And we continue and we conclude today's shir with the Mishnah. We're not going to begin the Gemara, as the Gemara is going to take us really all the way into Daf Yudalid. So let's at least learn the Mishnah. Says the Mishnah, Hareini Nazir. If someone says, I am a Nazir, Vin Nazir Kshuli Ben. I'm a Nazir, and I'm a Nazir when I will have a son. So what happens? His chila minus shalai. So he begins counting his regular 30 days in his years, and then lo and behold, he gives birth to a son. So what's the halacha? Mashlim es shalai. First, he finishes up the term of Nazir that he already accepted and started counting the 30 days. And then he begins a new Nazirus for his son. Case A. Case B. Hareini Nazir Shili Ben. The reverse. Someone says, I'm a Nazir when I have a kid. Vin Nazir, and I'm going to be a regular Nazir. So his Chalmai. But now instead of first counting for his son, he didn't have the son yet. So even though he said second, I'm a regular Nazir, but he began counting that first. And then his son is born to him. So because in this case, because he said Shuli Ben first, so he has to put on the side his own Nazirs that he's in middle. And count the Nazirs of having a child. as shelai. So two cases in a Mishnah, which one accepts the zeros and adds on a second zeros for a child. In case A, he finishes his own and then the son's. Case B, since he says the son's first, he has to interrupt his own, do for the son, and then do for himself. And we conclude, let's just read what the shaila is going to be that we'll talk about tomorrow. If someone says the following, Hareini Nazir la'achar esim yoyim, I'm a Nazir after 20 days. And from now 100 days. So we have a similar dual Naziros like we had in the Mishnah. He says, I'm a Nazir after 20 days. So in 20 days time, boom, kicks in his Naziros. And he also says, May Achshav, starting today, I'm a Nazir for 100 days. Ma'u, what's the halacha? Do we say, since of course, once he starts the 100, he can't be finished within 20. Therefore, loy chaylon. Therefore, what we say, it does not take effect the 100, and he first waits for the 20, and then he'll do the 100. But since it's going to be cutting the hair at the end, therefore it should be chal. We're going to stop over here. We'll read again the Shaila of Rava tomorrow as we'll deal with the Shaila for Daf Yud Dalid in Mirza Hashem.